Protests in Iran are alive and kicking, and they're spreading throughout the country despite the deadly crackdown by the regime. At the same time, in Russia, hundreds of thousands of people are voting with their feet and they're leaving the country as a reaction to Vladimir Putin expanding the draft to wider parts of the population. Can these protests be successful? And how are we to evaluate them? How can we actually support them if we find them honorable? And are regimes like Iran and Russia able to pull a Tiananmen Square type of massacre at the time where the whole world is watching from social media? This is Nikos, and this is New Ideal Live, the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. And with me today, my colleague Ben Bayer. Hi, Ben. And the first question is, why should one care about protests taking place in another country? Why should one take a position, and why should we bother in evaluating what is happening?
I think that's a really good question, and I think the answer has to do with understanding how philosophy applies to the real world. So, Russia and Iran are some of the starkest, clearest examples that we have today of just strict dictatorships, and they each, in their own way, exemplify one of the major four criteria that Ayn Rand herself gave for identifying dictatorships. They have one-party rule, they have censorship, they have expropriation of private property, and they have, in one form or another, executions without trial. They have them officially in Iran, I believe. They're not official in Russia, but there are also a lot of mysterious deaths of journalists and dissidents often by means of biological agents unavailable to private individuals, which I think has led a lot of people to believe these are executions by the state in indirect form. So we've got really hardcore dictatorships. How do they function? How does a dictatorship function? How does one deal with it? That's a question that should be on your mind if you're interested in preserving freedom around the world, and including wherever you live, because you need to know how dictatorships gain their power, how they lose their power. I should also mention, somewhat indirectly, I mean, both of these dictatorships are also countries that have historically threatened American interests and Western interests more generally because of the fact that they are dictatorships, because they are in effect at war with their people and deplete resources at home. They have to distract from that problem and begin to threaten populations abroad. And the ways in which Russia and Iran have done that are both obvious. Russia is a major nuclear power. Iran is an aspiring nuclear power. Iran is a sponsor of terrorism, which emanates from the same ideological orientation as its dictatorial regime. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out neither of us are experts on the two countries that we're about to discuss, or on the exact kind of policy that the West should have toward them. Although I think, Nikos, you have more expertise in international relations than I do. My background's in philosophy, though I should say I used to be an international relations major, focusing on Russian area studies for a while. But that being said, I think we can, with our philosophic background, observe some of the bigger, more obvious trends in these countries, and we can draw some lessons from them. We can see how certain philosophic principles are in action in a very stark way, and draw some at least generalized lessons for, I think, how we need to deal with these countries and how we need to think about what it takes to protect freedom generally all over the world.
And with these protests, some people are a bit skeptical, particularly in Iran, because they bring the examples of previous waves of protests, such as, for example, the Arab Spring, that have turned out in a way that would not be desirable for someone who shares, let's say, the values of freedom. But I think this time the protests in Iran are worth supporting, and let's see why. So the protests were triggered after a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian citizen called Masih Alinejad died in the hands of the police. So she was arrested for not observing the veiling laws, the law that says that a woman in Iran needs to cover her hair, her head, and her neck. So she died in custody under mysterious situations. There are many claims that there were signs in her body that she was being beaten up. The official line of the regime is that she died of heart attack, but what is not disputed is that she died in the hands of the regime, and she was arrested for the veiling laws. And the veiling laws is a very important characteristic of the Iranian regime. So the regime came to power in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution, but the revolution, the Iranian Revolution, was not only the Islamic Revolution. It was a revolution against the Shah, and it was supported by many secular Iranians. Actually, it was a very big revolution in terms of how many people participated. But the point of demarcation, the point when it became clear that now it's the radical Islamists that are the new order in Iran, was the imposition of the veiling laws. And this happened at some point very early in the first months after the 1979 revolution. So these laws are actually observed by a special branch of the police, the guidance patrol. So these people have as their job to find women who do not observe the veiling laws, or other people who are dressed indecently with whatever the regime thinks that is. And actually, many women are arrested every year. Sometimes they get away with a warning if a male citizen comes and says, yes, I know her, she's not going to do it again. But we've had cases of arrested women being beaten or being tortured and being terrorized. Now, the other very important thing is that the observance of the guide of the veiling law is a key characteristic of the regime. This is why it is observed not only by the official police, the guidance patrol, but also by the militias of the Revolutionary Guards of the Basids, which is the force within the Iranian society which is most loyal to the revolution and most loyal to the clergy. The Revolutionary Guards is the bigger body, and they have a particular branch, the Basids, that takes care of making sure that the society observes the ideology of the regime. So protests have spread throughout the country, and we've seen some images that are very, very, very powerful. We've seen women defying the authorities and taking out and unveiling their head and waving their hair, and it's there's some very powerful moments there. But also there has been a very strict crackdown by the regime, and the death toll, based on who you listen to, I think it's credible to say that more than 85 people have lost their lives. And actually, we can see that we have a very powerful video footage that was circulating in social media this morning. So let's have a look at it. So what we see here is, we can have the natural sound for a moment. So you see there many school children taking out their veils and shouting to this speaker. This speaker is part of the Basids militias. Again, this is the long arm of the Islamic Revolution. This is the long arm of the regime. And it has under its control the education system. So school children, young girls, heroic young girls, so openly define the authority of the Basids is something which is huge. And obviously the regime did not expect this. Otherwise, this guy would not go to the school. So the regime finds itself in a very difficult situation, in a situation where many people saying, we don't want you anymore. We know what you're about, and we're not buying what you're selling us anymore. The thing is, there have been revolts in the past in Iran. The latest example, 2009, the so-called Green, the movement that came as a reaction to an election that was considered to be rigged so as to favor an Islamic regime's hardliner. But it looks like something very big and important is happening in Iran these days.
Yeah, Nikos, I saw that same video this morning and was struck by it. As we've been seeing videos of street protests, mostly with adults, for several weeks now. But when it's gotten to the level of the kids are being willing to stand up, that's really astounding. And it's something that will connect to one of the themes we'll talk about later today in relation to Ayn Rand's own thinking about how people resist dictatorships around the world. Things have been unprecedented, I think, in Russia as well. And of course, the Putin regime has been headed in an increasingly authoritarian direction for more than a decade at this point. But the latest controversy comes, of course, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, February 2022, and almost immediately there were anti-war protests across Russia. One place I found said over 60 cities eventually became involved in these. And it's important to flag that the 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 different protests have been organized by a whole range of different groups across the political spectrum, communist groups, nationalist groups. What's especially interesting, though, is the most recent set of protests. So the initial set that was launched right after the Ukraine war began was more or less put down by Putin's uh, 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 security apparatus by late March, and had been sort of quiet since late March. But what changed, of course, is in September, the Ukrainian army started winning. They started pushing Russian lines back, sometimes even into the Donbass and the other occupied territories in the east that have been occupied since something like 2014. So making really, really aggressive moves to recapture lost territory. And the Russian lines are collapsing. It's clear the Russian soldiers are demoralized. So Putin decides to what he calls do a partial mobilization, which means he's imposing the draft, basically on all draft age men in Russia, aiming officially to collect to round up about 300,000 of them. Some people speculate that it's more than that. Well, that was the straw that broke the camel's back, in effect, because this is now really starting to affect broad sectors of the Russian populace. Even some Putin supporters found the methods used to start rounding people up to join the army to be rather arbitrary and capricious. And in this case, so a new round of street protests began, and they've been going on for a couple of weeks now in Russia. They've been spearheaded by a group named Vesna, which is a liberal democratic organization that's previously focused on opposing different forms of corruption and censorship on behalf of the Russian government. They've supported Alexei Navalny, who's one of the major opposition leaders. And what we have now is not just street protests. We have soldiers who are basically mutinying. We have anti-war petitions being spread, Russian celebrities speaking up. And since February, since the initial protests started, there have been something like 17,000 people arrested. And that isn't the end of it. The Russian state obviously didn't want this kind of protest to be occurring. They didn't want open dissent. They've passed laws now further repressing journalists and media outlets who not even necessarily because they were taking sides with the protesters, just because they were covering the fact that protests were happening. We've had several independent radio and TV stations shut off the air. There have been laws passed to basically make it illegal to even not only speak up in favor of the opposition, but also even to call what's happening a war, because of course what Putin wants to call this is a special military operation. It's not a war. We've seen the Russians restrict access to Western social media and broadcasts, and it's even now, I think, punishable by 10 years in prison to try to dodge the draft. But what I find especially astounding is in just the last week, uh, when immediately after this mobilization order was imposed, you've seen a real mass exodus of Russians, especially young ones of military draftable age, out of the country. Already, immediately after the war started, there was the beginnings of such an exodus. By some estimates, 300,000 Russians had fled by April. I saw one source suggesting that it's now something like 800,000 who've left. 300,000 of those were, maybe 400,000 of those were just since the draft order. And, it's hard to know how accurate those figures are, but, you get a sense that it must be tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people leaving, because there are videos of people lining up for miles and miles, maybe 9 miles on the Russian border with Georgia, trying to get out. And one figure that I found said that 100,000 of these people have fled to Kazakhstan. Who wants to flee to Kazakhstan when things are looking better there than Russia? There's a problem. So this is a huge problem for a country that has only got 147 million people, and which already is facing a demographic crunch because it's an aging population and there's a dearth of young people, the ones you need to prop up the economy, the ones that you need to be making it productive. Now they're all leaving because they don't want to be drafted. Their mothers are in the streets protesting because they don't want their sons sent away to a war that they don't understand why it's being fought. And I'll add one last figure to this, which is that by some estimates, there have been 80,000 Russian soldiers killed on the front line with Ukraine. And that's got to be figuring into the outrage. 80,000 soldiers in a war that has gone on for 6 months. Just as a way to contextualize that, there were about 58,000 Americans who died in the Vietnam War, which was a war that lasted 20 years. When you've got 80,000 dying in 6 months, that's a massive hit to the morale and to the well-being of the country. And so you get a sense of why these protests are happening.
And you mentioned Kazakhstan. Actually, it's probably not that bad. I recall applying to a university for a job there 10, 12 years ago, but that's for another story. So at the moment, every country in the area looks like a better choice than Russia, because even this veneer of freedom that existed before the war has now actually disappeared. So let me also say something about Iran and how Iran views these protests. So quite often when there is a regime that is under threat, the question is, can the regime liberalize itself a bit so that it stays in power? But the issue is here with Iran. The case is an either or. It's either the protesters that win or the regime, because the protests are not merely asking for something like we want higher wages. That the regime could accommodate. But if you see the slogan, which is life, freedom, women, one of the main slogans, or women wanting to live their life not under the Islamic law, this is something which is an existential threat for the regime. And this is an existential threat for the main power inside the Iranian society, which is the Revolutionary Guards. It's the people with the guns, to put it simply, and it's the people who have a carte blanche from the ideological elite of the movement, from the priests, from the council from the Guardian Council, which is the supreme leader, and some other clerics. They have a carte blanche to spill the blood. They have a carte blanche to intimidate and terrorize the protesters. So the stakes are very high. This is not a case where you can tell to the protesters, okay, I'm going to give you this, I'm going to throw you some slight reforms and we all go home happy. So Iran is capable of doing a very mild concessions. For example, recently we saw that women were for the first time allowed to attend football games. But the question is, can the regime survive a reform where women, for example, can unveil? My judgment is that no, the regime cannot survive this. So here's now what I see as the biggest question here. Is the Iranian regime, and we can also discuss about the Russian regime, is it willing and is it capable to spill mass blood in the streets? So, for example, the moment that comes to mind is Tiananmen, is the moment in 1989 where the Chinese people had stood up against the regime, and the regime was not afraid to spill the blood of citizens, to massacre the demonstrators. And back then, there was one picture, you've all seen it, the guy in front of the tanks holding his bags and putting his. So it was a passerby, it wasn't, but he thought at the moment that something is happening here which is important. I will stand in front of the tanks. And this one image became so iconic. So today, when we have social media, when we have the whole world watching Iran, the eyes are on Iran. Can the Iranian regime not terrorize and kill some people here and there in the dark or but can it spill the blood that it's definitely morally capable of spilling to end this? And something similar could be asked about Putin. So have you got thoughts on that, Ben?
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned that the Iranian regime has been able to appease its population to some extent by offering certain kinds of limited reforms, and that's allowed it to hang on to power. And I think there's a slightly different dynamic in Russia. What's pacified the population there and given Putin his base of support over the years that he's risen from an elected president to basically an unelected dictator has been his ability to deliver both prosperity through primarily through the energy industry, but also uh, glorious military victories. It's worth pointing out that Putin rose to power because of his success in wars that he initiated basically in places like Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea, and Syria. And so if his whole appeal is built on bringing glory to Russia through these kinds of military victories, what happens then when he stops winning? What happens when as is happening now, for the moment at least, in Ukraine? And what happens when you have more and more Russian soldiers being shipped home in body bags? I mean, 80,000 is a lot, and it's starting to impact Russian popular opinion. I've seen polls suggesting that upwards of 30% of Russian citizens now think the war is being lost in Ukraine. That's independent of whether or not they actually supported the goals of the war. Um, it used to be the case that so it's one thing to rally the population on your side. It's another thing to just keep them down through fear. It used to be that all Putin really needed to do to keep the population quiet was to silence the most vocal dissidents. When there were politicians or businessmen who stood up to him, tried to start alternate political movements, people like Navalny, he would just have them arrested or try to have them killed. In Navalny's case, both, and that would do enough for the time being to pacify the population because they could see from these big examples what would be done with them. But uh, now you have a lot more people who have to be silenced. If you've got 80,000 dead soldiers, all of whom have families, all of whom talk, even if you shut down dissent on the public airwaves, you can't stop people from talking to each other about how they're losing loved ones on the battlefield. He's got a much more daunting task. And I found a quotation in an NPR write-up about the protests where they interview someone on the street who says, "I haven't heard the word war out of Putin's mouth. And if there's no war, then how can we have a mobilization?" That's the draft, of course, says Natalia Zarina, a retired university professor in an interview with NPR. "He's calling up our young boys to die for nothing. I just couldn't stay home." So I mean, you can make it illegal to call it a war. It has to be called a special military operation. You can call it a partial mobilization, even if it's a draft of hundreds of thousands of people. But they're going to notice. These people are going to start to notice, however, whatever the propaganda says, that their friends and loved ones are dying and not coming back. So, what can someone like Putin do if it's not to just, if censorship isn't enough? What can he do to try to justify himself rather than simply by lying to the people? Well, as far as I see, there's only a couple of things he can do. I mean, one is that he can try to claim the moral high ground by saying, and this is one of the things he's trying to do right now. He can say, look, the people in Luhansk and Donbass have voted to join the Russian Federation, and therefore when he's fighting this war in Ukraine, it's really in the name of justice. It's in the name of democracy. It's to protect the people who really want to be part of his country. And that kind of thing has worked for him in the past. It worked primarily when he did the same thing in Crimea in 2014. But here it's just so much harder to make that story seem plausible, because everybody knows that the so-called election that they just had last week to legitimize the Russian annexation was basically held in a war zone. That many of these provinces are actively in combat situations. There's no way that a fair and free election could have happened in a circumstance like this, especially when you hear rumors about people being threatened by the Russian soldiers to go and vote, or bribed to go and vote. There's no way this can be seen as a free and fair election. And so this gives the lie to the idea that what he's really doing here is coming to the aid of the Ukrainians. And the other thing that he can do, if that doesn't work, and you see him possibly moving in the same direction, is leave aside whatever the question of the justice of the war is. If enough Russian soldiers die there, and a lot of them are dying, and he can tell a story that the soil of Ukraine has been watered by the blood of Russian soldiers, and if this war not to have been in vain, we need to avenge them, and therefore we need to double down and sacrifice some more in order to save face for Russia. And this has worked for Russians in the past. I mean, it's worked. I think your own book has made the point that the Russians have an infinite tolerance for sacrifice. This is certainly the way that Stalin conducted World War II. But we also know that
the Finnish War before World War II, again, massive casualties, which at the end, however, Soviet Union won.
Yeah, and so this is, I mean, it's possible that what happens is the Russians double down in their willingness to sacrifice for this alleged cause. But even the Russians have their limits. And I mean, you saw this toward the end of the Soviet Union. You saw it especially with the war in Afghanistan, that after a certain point, it was obvious that the Soviets were not winning. They were losing, again, tens of thousands of troops. And it started to erode the position of the government. It started to make the government look less credible. This is something we're going to talk more about. And so at a certain point, they were no longer able to muster the authority. They needed to stay in power. And this is something that we talked about on a previous podcast, that when it came time to try to put down rebellions in various breakaway republics, like in the Baltic states, the Soviet army just didn't have the will to put down these popular protests. What was the cause they were fighting for? It was it was for a regime that had sent their own comrades into pointless battle in Afghanistan. So the big question, I think, for both of these cases is whether Putin and whether the mullahs can still muster the necessary will to sacrifice on the part of the population to put up with the injustice that they're seeing in front of them perpetrated by the regime. And I have my doubts about the ability to do it. I mean, Putin just gave a lengthy speech justifying his annexation of eastern Ukrainian provinces. And the most notable thing to me about the speech was the only thing he's able to invoke in order to try to justify what he's doing, the main thing that he dwells on, is grievances against the West, explaining how he thinks Western culture is bankrupt and decadent. And I mean, he even at one point mentions transgender ideology. So we're really supposed to, he's really expecting the Russians to die in Ukraine to oppose transgender ideology. I mean, the most that he can do.
There are people in the West who are buying this. I know many libertarians, like spend 5 minutes on the libertarian or the quote dissident right spaces in social media. You will see that many people are buying this and are, I don't want to call them useful idiots because I think this is a compliment. They are actually cheerleading Putin. So, but even this image that Putin had as like, I am the protector of these values. As you said, when people end up back home in coffins, this goes, at some point, it goes away. At some point, someone shouts, wait a minute, the emperor has no clothes. And I think this will be the moment where Putin's own propaganda will not make sense, Ben. And these days, particularly with that protesting against that regime ambassador who was at their school, I was the scene playing in my mind was this iconic video from 1989, December 1989, where the ruler of Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu, the socialist ruler of Romania, is giving a speech from a balcony. Interestingly, he had just come back from Iran, so thuggish regimes are always in good terms. And he thought that he's going to sell his usual lies and his usual stories. And the people who were put into buses to go, almost forced to go to that demonstration, they will use, they will actually believe him. So it's very interesting. You see a leader who is bored, who doesn't even believe in his own words. Then you see some people applauding, and then it takes a few people, very few. We're talking about hundreds of thousands. Very few start booing or asking very loudly questions, and within 2 minutes, you see more and more people saying, "Oh yeah, you're right. This guy is talking nonsense. We don't believe you. You say you are for the people. We are the people." To cut a long story short, within 10 minutes, Ceausescu had to disappear from the scene, and this triggered the process that within 3 days led to his demise and the fall of the regime. So I encourage people to go and watch that video. It's Ceausescu's last speech, or you can put on YouTube however you want.
Yeah, and I
And
remember
it
seeing.
gives you this lesson that taking away the moral sanction, or in simple words, telling to the tyrant, telling to the dictator, we know who you are. We don't believe you. You say you are for the workers. We are the workers. Or similarly, the Basids, the Revolutionary Guard militant, a militiaman, going to the school, and the students throwing their veil to him and saying, get out of here. Our education is not your job. This is a moment which more and more people shout, the emperor has no clothes. So maybe, I don't know, I'm carried away by the atmosphere of the day, and I started my day watching this video from Iran. So maybe I'm too optimistic. But there is a point after which a regime has lost its legitimacy. And then this gets internalized from the regime. Then the police officer starts asking questions. Shall we spill that blood? For what? Or and it's like a wave, because courage is contagious. When you see people standing up, you do things that you would never believe that you would do. I have a family member who participated in the revolt against the Greek dictatorship in 1973. And when I asked her, how did you do it? I didn't think you were so courageous, no offense. She would tell me, this is when you see other people standing up with courage, you get this courage. And it's not an act of sacrifice. It's, in a way, it's the opposite. Notice the protesters in Iran. They're radiant. Of course, they know they put their lives in danger, but they're enthusiastic, they're radiant, and in some ways, they're the exact opposite of the image I have in my mind of protesters in the West. So, Ben, you were reading also an essay by Ayn Rand, which is related to protest and the inexplicable personal alchemy. So, what's your, how did it make you understand better or see these protests under a different prism?
Yeah, this is an essay that I think a lot of people should take a look at. We'll give some information on how to find it later. It's called The Inexplicable Personal Alchemy. She wrote it in 1969. It's the obvious essay to talk about in connection with our topic today, because she's writing about the events of 1968 in Russia and Eastern Europe, where the Russians invaded Czechoslovakia to put down a rebellion. To put down the Prague Spring is what you've heard of. And there were protests in Russia about it, just like there are protests today about Russian invasion of Ukraine. There were dissidents who protested in Red Square against the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Several of them were put on trial. And the article begins by actually reprinting a New York Times account of the scene of what's happening when these dissidents are on trial, because another protest breaks out outside the court in support of the dissidents. And you have the bizarre prospect of Russian dissidents protesting and arguing with people who are in fact secret police, trying to explain to them why these people being put on trial are being treated unjustly, and what's wrong with the injustice of the Soviet regime. And the question that the average observer is going to ask about this is, why are they doing this? What do they think they can possibly accomplish? Do they think they can change the mind of the secret police? The New York Times reporter Henry Kalm calls it an inexplicable personal alchemy, and that's of course where the article gets its title. But Ayn Rand says at one point that it's not inexplicable. It's that these are young people who have not become cynical with the world yet. They're intelligent people who still think that ideas matter, who still think that the truth matters, and who still think that the people they're dealing with and trying to persuade are, like them, human beings who should care about the truth and about the consequence of the different ideas that are at play. And so that's why they're doing this, what's a seemingly futile act of trying to argue with the secret police. And it connects to one of the major issues that we've been talking about today, not just to speculate about what's motivating at least some of the protesters in both Russia and Iran, but it points to something very important about the central role of moral sanction and of the moral authority that regimes have if they need to be able to continue to govern their population. So I'd like to put up a quotation from that article, Inexplicable Personal Alchemy, because this is one that's actually in parentheses in the article, but it's so important to what we're talking about today. She writes, "A dictatorship has to promulgate some sort of distant goals and moral ideals in order to justify its rule and the people's immolation. The extent to which it succeeds in convincing its victims is the extent of its own danger. Sooner or later, its contradictions are thrown in its face by the best of its subjects, the ablest, the most intelligent, the most honest. Thus, a dictatorship is forced to destroy and to keep on destroying the best of its human resources. And be it 50 years or 5 centuries later, ambitious thugs and lethargic drones are all a dictatorship will have left to exploit and rule. The rest will die young, physically or spiritually." And I think what we see happening in Russia and Iran right now is the best are speaking up. Some of them are dying. Some of them are fleeing the country. And it's got to be for the reasons that she's pointing out here, is that the contradictions of the regime's rationalizations are becoming too obvious and evident to be explained away, that the censorship and propaganda are not enough to make it go away. And the distant goals and moral ideals that she speaks of here, that they use in order to justify their rule and the people's immolation, are becoming more and more distant. And Nikos, one of the things I wanted to say about that Putin speech, where the most that he can do is to blame the West, is notably missing from the speech was really any kind of articulation of any positive ideals about what the Russians hope to accomplish in Ukraine. Here he is trying to justify his annexation of territories that he's basically seized through a war of aggression, with the thinnest veneer of justification in terms of the vote of the populace, as if elections have ever mattered much to Putin, who's basically made himself president for life. And he can't even articulate what it's all for. He can say, we hate the West, we're opposing the West, some kind of vague anti-colonialist language, which is pretty hard to square with the fact that he's just invaded and occupied a country. And all for the sake of what? It's not even indicated. All he's got to go on is hatred and fear of the West, nothing positive to be achieved by it. And that, I think, is going to lead to his undoing sooner or later. We can't predict how soon, but you see his people realizing that they're being asked to sacrifice for the sake of nothing. Some of them who are the drones, some of them who don't want to live themselves are going to go along with it, because not everybody wants to live. Not everybody wants to be free. But the ones who do are either going to die trying to be free, or they're going to get out of Dodge. And we see that happening increasingly in Russia, and I think also in Iran.
So another thing the last thing I want to bring up, Ben, is what could we do? And when I say we, I mean it in two ways. One, how does an individual give their sanction? Before we get to that, what should our governments do? So let's put it already on the table. Supporting someone who is revolting against a tyrant or defending themselves against the tyrant is not a call that we go and die in that war or we engage our military. Maybe some people feel so inspired to do this that they can volunteer and do so. But this is one thing, because very often people will say, "Oh, you talk all the time about Ukraine. Would want to die for it?" No, if I want to die for it and whether I'll give my moral support is two completely different things. And I think there's a lot of cynicism by people who are very anxious not to support Ukraine because for reasons that we can discuss at some other point. But how should our governments react? So 2009, as we said, there was another time when the Iranian regime was under a lot of pressure. Then Barack Obama, the then president, decided not to intervene, even in terms of his rhetoric in favor of the revolt. And if you believe his supporters or the people who were in his team, the rationale was, look, Iranian propaganda says that this is a revolt which is encouraged by the CIA. Therefore, if we go out and support openly their revolt, we are singing in the Iranian regime's tunes. We are actually doing their propaganda for them. So the first thing I want you to do, Ben, is to tell me what's your opinion on that. The second thing to put on the table is what has been the reaction of the US government this time. So the President Biden, has given his support to the protesters from I think it was in the United Nations. Also, this time we have some indirect or semi-direct support through technical assistance, trying to keep the internet going with satellites and things like that. Also, we have to say private companies like Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram. So the Meta company, how it's called, is actually wanting to playing a role and showing some support to the protesters. And the third thing that this time the official US government has done is to put the guidance patrol, which again is the morality police of the Iran, under sanction. So their point is, we are going to punish the people who are behind the death of the 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian girl. And to do this, we are sanctioning the guidance patrol. So two questions. One, what do you say to the people who would say, don't support the protesters, because then you are actually verifying what the regime is saying, that these are, quote, foreign agency backed? And the second is, has this time the US government stood its ground in a better way than Obama did in 2009?
Like I said at the beginning, I don't think we're in a position to propose the exact policy stance that the West should take in response to these protests, in response to the regimes who are cracking down on them. I think we can call BS about what they say, though, and the idea that if you offer any kind of support for the protesters, then this will give the regime ammunition for saying that they're really just being engineered or astroturfed by the West. It doesn't. I don't think that matters. I mean, if it were a justifiable thing to do, then it would be a justifiable thing to do, regardless of what bad propaganda the regimes want to make out of it. But I mean, it's an interesting, debatable policy proposition. What kind, if any, of direct support should be given to them? I certainly don't think there's any grounds to get involved militarily with Russia right now. They're much too much of a nuclear threat. But there's a case to be made for certain kinds of sanctions. I don't see, if you're going to have sanctions, there's no grounds for restricting them in the narrow way that you've talked about, the way they're doing it with Iran, to just sanction the individual morality police and not the regime as such. They're obviously under the employ of the regime. It's the regime that's directing them. It's the regime that's posing all these kinds of threats, not just to the populace, but to the West. And so that leads me to the broader thing that I think we can say with a reasonable amount of certainty about what the West should be doing, and that's that it should not be supporting these regimes in the way that it sometimes does. I mean, right now with Iran, we have the bizarre specter of Biden, yes, offering some kind of verbal support for the protesters, but still trying to engage in a charade of diplomatic negotiations with Iran to come to some kind of accommodation about its nuclear program. You can't simultaneously support those protesters while treating with dignity and cordiality their murderers. You can't do it. And I mean, more generally, I think there are, for both of these regimes, the fact that we're trying to maintain any kind of any kind of positive diplomatic relations with them at all is something very difficult to justify. And maybe this is a good place for us to play one last video, because especially with regard to the situation in Iran, I have found in the last month or so Masih Alinejad's comments to be most enlightening. She was a dissident in Iran. She escaped. She lives in the United States. Recently, the Iranians sent thugs to try to assassinate her. And she's a really passionate and principled advocate for the victims in Iran. And in this video, she's speaking to the Western leaders with her view of what they need to do, and in particular, what not to do. And I think she's got it exactly right. So let's hear what Alinejad has to say.
Hi, my name is Masih Alinejad. I'm an Iranian journalist, women's rights activist, campaigner against compulsory hijab. I made this video for all those female politicians from the Western countries who ignored us for years and years. I have been calling on you in European Parliament, in Canadian Parliament, Norwegian Parliament, Swedish Parliament for years and years. I ask you not to obey compulsory hijab law. I ask you, when you go and visit the murderers of my country, Iran, don't wear hijab. Don't legitimize our oppressors. You did. I have been warning you for years and years. I've been telling you about the dangers of hijab police. I've been sharing a lot of videos of Iranian women getting beaten up by morality police. But you ignored us. You ignored millions of Iranian women inside the country who are right now removing their hijab and facing guns and bullets. You know why? Because the same police killed Masih Amini, 20-year-old woman, for just a bit of hair. Hair was visible. Now, I call on you, Ann Linde from Sweden, Catherine Ashton from European Parliament, Federico Mogherini from EU. I'm calling on you, Ségolène Royal. I'm calling on all female politicians from Western countries. Now, it's your turn. Make a video and say that you were wrong. Say that you celebrated Hijab Day. Now, it's your turn to mourn for Masih Amini and show your solidarity with Iranian women. I remember that when I asked you not to wear hijab, you said that, we are there to solve bigger problems. You see now, for a small problem, small piece of cloth, women are getting killed right now and the regime shut down the internet. It's your turn. I'm not asking you to cut your hair the way that Iranian women doing this in public. I'm not even asking you to burn headscarf, because for millions of Iranians, it's important to hear from you that you were wrong. And from now on, you're not gonna wear hijab in front of our murderers. And most important than this, you're not gonna legitimize our murderers. This is your time. Because for millions of Iranians, Mahsa's brutal death became a turning point. For Islamic Republic, it's a tipping point. The only thing can save them, it's you. We don't want you to save us. Stop saving our murderers. Stop helping them. Make a video and say her. Iranians are calling on you, all the democratic countries. Now it's your turn. Kick out all the Islamic Republic diplomats. Kick out all the Islamic Republic officials. Shut down their embassies everywhere because they're killing people inside the country. It's your time to take action. If you don't get united to end Islamic terror, believe me, the terrorists, they will get united and they end UN democracy.
Yeah, so the most telling words there, I think, are, we don't want you to save us. We want you to stop saving our murderers. And that's what the West has been doing by granting diplomatic legitimacy to the Russian authoritarian regime and to the Ayatollahs in Iran. And I mean, she's even calling for, we're officially not supposed to have diplomatic recognition for Iran ever since the revolution in '79, and they invaded our embassy, but we still have fake, phony diplomats, the Iranian interest section, and those are the ones that she's asking to be kicked out. That would, I think, also entail ending the diplomatic negotiation over Iran's nuclear program. Not that we would ever trust them to abide by an agreement that we came to with them in the first place. So Nikos, do you have any final thoughts on Alinejad or any of the other issues before we start to wrap up?
Well, the final thoughts are, I'll be a bit pessimist in terms of how much the West has actually understood what the situation is in terms of how bad the Iranian regime is. And we did an episode some weeks ago with Elan where we talked a bit about that. But the fact that they're still on the table with Iran on a deal, and we're talking about a deal where you don't have anything to gain. It's like I'm going to a deal with a thug, and the thug says, I'm not going to hit you, and you give me this. I have nothing to gain for that, particularly if I'm way stronger than the thug, as it's the case with the United States and Iran. And particularly this thing where they are putting sanctions on the guidance patrol, but not on the regime. This is what Ayn Rand would call evasion. I'm trying to close my eyes to reality. This would be the equivalent for our friends to understand what this means. Imagine if saying, I will go to war against the SS and against the Gestapo, but not against the Third Reich, not against the Nazi government. This is the equivalent of Western governments saying, we will impose sanctions on the guidance control, but at the same time, we're back. There's still a chance that we will discuss with Iran and will normalize our relations. There's nothing to be normalized because she said something very, very correct in the video. The Iranian regime does not care about security, does not care about its geopolitical interest. It's care about its ideology. It's a regime that would rather die and perish and take its enemies with it, with its ideas, rather than live and prosper without its ideas. Don't take my word for this. Spend 5 minutes reading what the Iranian Revolutionary Guards tell about themselves and the way they view the world, or spend 5 minutes watching either Ayatollah Khomeini or the current supreme leader, and you'll be convinced about what Iran is about.
So before we wrap up, let me just thank a few people who've sent us super chats. I don't know if we can answer all of the questions, but let me answer one question that's come in at least, and that's from Gail. Gail asks, how can American politicians be so blinded that they can cozy up to and support horrific dictators? And I think that the answer to that question, Gail, I can't give you a full answer, but part of it is going to have to do with the fact that many of these many Western leaders share some of the same moral ideals that the regimes are invoking in order to justify themselves. And so, if the Russians say, we believe in sacrifice for the greater good of the nation, the Western leaders can't say, well, that's a corrupt ideal, because they share in the Judeo-Christian idea that there's a virtue in sacrifice. If the Iranian regime says that we are a holy regime dedicated to God and his higher purposes, it's again hard for Western leaders to attack the legitimacy of that ideal when they themselves think that there is something holy and sacred about religion, even if they don't happen to be Islamic. They're Christian, and they still think God is somebody who's a worthy object of sacrifice. So that's the best I can do on that. Well, there's the second point, which is that insofar as they themselves share in those ideals, they also think that it's good for them to sacrifice, in that they think compromising their interests in the form of a negotiation is justifiable. Who are Western leaders to stand up for their people and their principles? Who are they to think that other countries should abide by principles of Western liberalism and individualism? It would be arrogant and prideful. And if you believe that there's a virtue in sacrifice, and if there's a virtue in humility, then that dictates compromise in diplomacy. And that's exactly what we've seen them do. And Nikos, do you have anything to add there?
Many things to add, but just to tell people that we are also going to be in Clubhouse. So I was trying to think something about the question, which means I lost your part. So I'll keep my thoughts for the Clubhouse on that.
Okay, well, let's wrap up then. And the first thing we should remind people about is that we will be going into Clubhouse right after this. Get the Clubhouse app, search for the Ayn Rand Club. You'll find Nikos and me discussing this and answering more of your questions on this topic for maybe 30, 45 minutes afterwards. I also want to let you know about some resources you can take a look at if you want to learn more about the ideas that we talked about today. So I did another New Idea Live podcast with my colleague Agustina Vergara Cid some months ago, right after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, on the topic of Ukraine and the power of moral judgment. Here we talked about more about the Western response to Russia's aggression, and why it's important not to support them diplomatically, and why it's important to condemn them. Why, for example, Biden was right to say that Putin's regime must come to an end, whether or not he really meant it. That's exactly what the Russians need to hear if they're to lose the moral authority and the moral sanction that's otherwise empowered them. Also like to recommend another resource for you, and that's do we have the other podcast, or were we able to put what's the next slide? Okay, so we don't have that other podcast, but we talked today about the Inexplicable Personal Alchemy essay by Ayn Rand. This is available if you get a copy of her book, The Return of the Primitive. It's a short essay. It's probably some of Rand's most powerful writing. Certainly, it's on an issue that's of personal significance to her, given that she was herself a refugee from Soviet communism. And then let me tell you about next week's show. Next week, Nikos will be back with my colleague Ilan Journo to talk about the new ideas from Francis Fukuyama. He's the one who predicted the end of history, or at least he's thought to have predicted that. He's got a new book out, Liberalism and Its Discontents. Nikos, did you want to say anything more about this?
Yes, so even if you are not interested in Fukuyama himself, it's going to be an interesting discussion. And I'll also throw on the paper the issue of liberalism. So is liberalism the way classical liberals and other people call it? How should we understand it? Should we be in favor of it? Can we reclaim the title? So there's some quite interesting questions. So whether you're interested in Fukuyama or in his thought or on the issue of liberalism, I think it's going to be an interesting discussion next week. Probably it's going to be Thursday with Elan. And also mentioning Elan, we did 3-4 weeks ago. So go in the Ayn Rand Institute channel, go in the playlist with the New Ideas Live. We did an episode on Iran, which is mention some of the things that were discussed today. So if you want to spend some time to understand Iran better, after you've watched this and you join us in Clubhouse, check this out from some, again, New Idea Live from some weeks ago, the episode I did with Elan on Iran. We talked about the Revolutionary Guards. We talked about the war with Iraq in the 80s. So it's going to give you a good understanding of the country.
Another announcement about an upcoming event that's of special significance given what we talked about today. The Ayn Rand Institute has regular donor roundtable meetings about every month, and the one that's coming up at the end of this month is of special interest in relation to this topic. We're calling it Ayn Rand Speaks to Russia. This will occur Saturday, October 29th, you need to be an ARI member in order to attend. But if you go to the ARI website, you'll find out how easy that is to become. This will be the exclusive debut of Ayn Rand's interview in Russian with the Voice of America in 1968. This is I think the only time I've ever heard her speaking her native tongue. But this is just around the same time as the Prague Spring is happening. Now, she doesn't comment much on contemporary affairs in Eastern Europe, but she's instead introducing her philosophy to a Russian-speaking audience, and we're giving our donors first exclusive opportunity to listen to this 15-minute recording. We played 5 minutes of it OCon this year, but now you're going to be able to hear the whole 15 minutes. Whole thing's been translated for you to see, and after that, we'll be putting it on YouTube and perhaps other channels with the hopes that it will reach Russian-speaking people around the world, because God knows they need to hear it right now. Let's see so that's again Saturday, October 29th. I think the last few announcements here are just to remind you that if you enjoyed what we talked about today, please be sure to subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Click the bell to get notifications for when we go live. Please subscribe, and if you're watching a recording of this, leave a comment, share it, like it, help us reach a wider audience. Same thing if you're watching on Facebook. And if you have questions about anything that came up today, if you'd like to suggest to us new topics, if you have or comments that you'd like to make, send us an email at newideal@aynrand.org. We read all your emails, try to reply to as many of them as possible. One thing I'd like to especially encourage people to send us is questions for an upcoming episode. 2 weeks from today, we're going to be doing one of our Q&A episodes, this time just on a specific topic. The topic will be free will. And so if you have questions about the objectivist view of free will, about what's wrong with determinism, please flag that in the email that you send to newideal@aynrand.org. We're going to be collecting those and doing a special Q&A episode just on the subject of free will. That's in about 2 weeks. I'll be doing that one with my colleague, Associate Fellow Mike Mazza. So I think that's everything for the day. Thanks, Nikos, for this stimulating conversation. And we will be heading over to Clubhouse right now to continue to answer your questions. Thanks, everybody.